Welcome to Editing for the Mass Market, Tips and Tidbits from the Queen's Night Market Vendor Stories Oral History Project. This is the fourth event in our spring season of this year-long oral history workshop series, Oral History Empower. Tonight's event is made possible in part by the Paul F. Lazarsfeld Fund, and we want to acknowledge that we're very grateful for that support. Okay, let's see. I'm gonna see if I can breathe and talk at the same time today. So wish me luck with that. My name is Carlin Liuzia, and I help to coordinate this series alongside Amy Starczewski. And I also teach in the Oral History Master of Arts program here at Columbia. One class is a sort of conversation that goes alongside with this workshop series. So we just came from a really great chat with Storm Garner, our guest tonight, who, because we went long on that, sort of got shortchanged on her break. So she's gonna be video off here to eat and drink a little bit before the main event, but Storm is here. As this event was coming up and I was thinking about sort of the multiple facets of the Queen's Night Market and the Vendor Stories Oral History Project and Storm's work and what she'll share with us this evening, as well as thinking about the conversation that we've been having sort of all year in this series and recent events. I kept thinking about this one particular essay by a writer, teacher, scholar, botanist, mother, polyhyphenate, Potawatomi writer, Robin Wall Kimmerer, who I've invoked in this space before, and some of you may know or remember. She has this essay in her collection, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. And I thought that instead of trying to explain all of the resonances, that I might just read to you for a little bit as we get started here. And as I was looking at the parts that I wanted to read, I was like, oh, these are a little long, but I didn't want to cut anything. So I thought, let me just time it and see, and found that it's 5 minutes. So it kind of fits perfectly in our usual timing for these events. I also am realizing I forgot to share where I'm joining from this evening, which is Western Wyoming, the unceded lands of the Shoshone-Bannock, the Eastern Shoshone, and the Cheyenne peoples. And of course, as a member of OMA and Columbia, I'm also still benefiting from the violent dispossession of the Lenape people that created the place we now call New York City. So I invite you to sit back, relax, think about your breathing, and listen to this really wonderful passage. The essay is called The Three Sisters. It should be them who tell this story. Corn leaves rustle with a signature sound, a papery conversation with each other and the breeze. On a hot day in July, when the corn can grow 6 inches in a single day, there's a squeak of internodes expanding, stretching the stem toward the light. Leaves escape their sheaths with a drawn-out creak, and sometimes when all is still, you can hear the sudden pop of ruptured pith when water-filled cells become too large and turgid for the confines of the stem. These are the sounds of being, but they are not the voice. The beans must make a caressing sound, a tiny hiss as a soft-haired leader twines around the scabrous stem of corn. Surfaces vibrate delicately against each other. Tendrils pulse as they cinch around a stem, something only a nearby flea beetle could hear. But this is not the song of beans. I've lain among ripening pumpkins and heard creaking as the parasol leaves rock back and forth, tethered by their tendrils, wind lifting their edges and easing them down again. A microphone in the hollow of a swelling pumpkin would reveal the pop of seeds expanding and the rush of water filling succulent orange flesh. These are sounds, but not the story. Plants tell their stories not by what they say, but by what they do. What if you were a teacher but had no voice to speak your knowledge? What if you had no language at all and yet there was something you needed to say? Wouldn't you dance it? Wouldn't you act it out? Wouldn't your every movement tell the story? In time, you would become so eloquent that just to gaze upon you would reveal it all. And so it is with these silent green lives. A sculpture is just a piece of rock with topography hammered out and chiseled in, but that piece of rock can open your heart in a way that makes you different for having seen it. It brings its message without a single word. Not everyone will get it, though. The language of stone is difficult. Rock mumbles. But plants speak in a tongue that every breathing thing can understand. Plants teach in a universal language, food. And I'm going to skip a part where Kimmerer describes the practice of planting corn, beans, and squash together and the choreography of their growth, how their individual paces and patterns complement each other perfectly. And then she goes on. Native people speak of this gardening style as the three sisters. There are many stories of how they came to be, but they all share the understanding of these plants as women, sisters. Some stories tell of a long winter when the people were dropping from hunger. 3 beautiful women came to their dwellings on a snowy night. One was a tall woman dressed all in yellow with long flowing hair. The second wore green, and the third was robed in orange. The 3 came inside to shelter by the fire. Food was scarce, but the visiting strangers were fed generously, sharing in the little that the people had left. In gratitude for their generosity, the 3 sisters revealed their true identities, corn, beans, and squash, and gave themselves to the people in a bundle of seeds so that they might never go hungry again. At the height of the summer, when the days are long and bright, and the thunderers come to soak the ground, the lessons of reciprocity are written clearly in a 3 sisters' garden. Together, their stems inscribe what looks to me like a blueprint for the world, a map of balance and harmony. The corn stands 8 feet tall. Rippling green ribbons of leaf curl away from the stem in every direction to catch the sun. No leaf sits directly over the next, so that each can gather light without shading the others. The bean twines around the corn stalk, weaving itself between the leaves of corn, never interfering with their work. In the spaces where corn leaves are not, buds appear on the vining bean and expand into outstretched leaves and clusters of fragrant flowers. The bean leaves droop and are held close to the stem of the corn. Spread around the feet of the corn and beans is a carpet of big, broad squash leaves that intercept the light that falls among the pillars of corn. Their layered spacing uses the light, a gift from the sun, efficiently, with no waste. The organic symmetry of forms belongs together. The placement of every leaf, the harmony of shapes speak their message. Respect one another, support one another, bring your gift to the world and receive the gifts of others, and there will be enough for all. By late summer, the beans hang in heavy clusters of smooth green pods. Ears of corn angle out from the stalk, fattening in the sunshine, and pumpkins swell at your feet. Acre for acre, a 3 sisters garden yields more food than if you grew each of the sisters alone. And again, that's the beginning of The 3 Sisters by Robin Wall Kimmerer from her collection Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. I hope you hear the connections already, and as tonight's event goes along. And I really encourage you to read more from Braiding Sweetgrass. There's so much there for us as oral historians to learn, and as people, especially those of us who are guests on this land. For anyone who's just arrived, we're here tonight for Editing for the Mass Market, Tips and Tidbits from the Queen's Night Market Vendor Stories Oral History Project. We're joined today by Storm Garner, creator of the QNM Vendor Stories Oral History Project and co-author of The World Eats Here, a narrative cookbook. And we'll be hearing from those combined projects this evening. So please join me in welcoming Storm Garner.
Hi, everyone. Am I fully present? It's so hard to tell. I'm trying. Thank you so much, Carlin, for that centering reading. I needed that. I was sipping my tea and eating olives to lubricate my throat because I'm losing my voice. So I'm going to try to get in that zone that you've just created as much as possible over the course of this evening. Thanks everybody for joining. Oh wow, I can see everyone. Cool. I'm going to be sharing a PowerPoint presentation I made and a bunch of links, and it's going to be very all over the place. So bear with me during the transitions. And I guess I'll jump right into it, and there will be time for questions at the end. And I think I'm going to try to actually beat my time a little, because everybody asks such cool questions, and I feel like those are probably going to be more interesting than what I've prepared anyway. So I'll just, please make gestures if I get long-winded, because that's what I tend to do. And I'll hurry along. Okay. So let us start with, can everyone see that? That's my, that's the photo that is actually, oh, I should have said hi at the beginning. Should have shown you the actual book, which is right next to me. I'll show you later. I'm very proud of this picture because it's mine and it made it onto the cover of the book. But as you see, this is the Queen's Night Market on a normal, bustling summer pre-pandemic day in 2018. This is right outside of the Hall of Science in Corona, Queens, and it's probably sunset time. It goes from 6 to midnight or 5 to midnight on Saturday summer evenings, and people are just having a great time trying food from all over the world. Every little tent you see represents a new little small business selling food from a different country or home culture. It doesn't always correlate with legal definitions of country. Anyway, we'll go into it more. But I want to start with the picture to sort of situate you, because it's such a crazy fantasy these days. It sounds so surreal imagining ourselves in a crowd like this. You know, who knows if that'll ever happen again in the pandemic era. So this is it's going to be a very practical minded presentation, editing for the mass market. Tips and tidbits from the Queen's Night Market Vendor Stories Oral History Project. So that is my project. Oh, that is me. I'm Storm Garner, and I will share my contact info, and I encourage you to email me with any questions that come up. How are we going to spend the next hour? One, we're going to talk about the Queen's Night Market Vendor Stories Oral History Project, and to some derivative public-facing products I've made so far from these interviews, such as a book and podcast collaborations and other publications. And then I'm going to give some lessons I've learned. So hopefully you all can learn from my mistakes, or weigh in on them and help me do better next time. Some considerations for you about sharing other people's stories with a new or wider public. There's going to be a little workshop moment if there's time, hopefully, and a Q&A at the end. So about the Queen's Night Market Vendor Stories Oral History Project. What is the Queen's Night Market? Why did I want to document it? What's in it so far? How it will be used? I'm going to stop share to change my screen and bring you right to my little website. So this is about the project, and it's very, as you can see, low tech with my cute little drawing. But since 2015, the Queen's Night Market has fed over 1 million curious visitors affordable street foods from over 90 countries in a fun, open-air, family-friendly setting that can't seem to help but foster spontaneous cross-cultural friendships among its diverse clientele. The vendors themselves are usually too busy to converse much while their market is up and running. So the Queensland Market Vendor Stories Oral History Project quite simply offers a chance to hear from some of them as new Americans, as entrepreneurs, as community members, and of course as serious food lovers. I wanted to, before I discuss the project at length, just have you hear an excerpt I made from the first vendor interview I did. This is actually not a food vendor, but a merchandise vendor. She has a little tent boutique called the August Tree and now runs the Queen's Museum gift shop. This is Christine Jean-Charquet. She's been a great help and inspiration to me, guiding the construction of the whole project.
It's 6:30. Storm, you might want to change the settings so the sound on your desktop is coming through.
So I
Oh,
just
it's
gave
done?
up and started my own business because I didn't want to
Hold on.
deal with it. It was so difficult.
we can
It
hear.
was like on a daily basis.
It didn't work?
I had to defend my university degree.
Now we could hear.
Yeah, Storm, it looks like we might have a mix of people who can hear and people who can't hear. So maybe let's try
Oh, no.
sharing the screen and just make sure that box is checked and we'll give it another try.
Oh, do I have to maybe I
Yeah,
have to re-click it every time?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. No, it's clicked.
It's clicked. Okay. Maybe folks who aren't able to hear it here can check out the website and listen after the event.
Oh, should I just skip it then?
You can keep playing it. Yeah, because I think a lot of people can hear it. Yeah, so go ahead.
I don't know where we were.
I am an immigrant, but the way I was raised, my mom raised me to be queen, you know? I'm not going to change that because I'm in New York. I'm a woman. I'm olive skinned and have black hair and I pronounce my T's, you know? So I just gave up and started my own business because I didn't want to deal with it. It was so difficult. It was so hard. You know, you get $50 sales in a month and you're so happy. So, and then when we started the Queen's Night Market, it just changed. You know, it kept us afloat. It keeps the store open for the whole year. But then at the end of the day, it's not that keeps us there. At the end of the day, it's the idea of feeling accepted. And I'm not minority. It's too diverse to say there's a minority. And the feeling of that acceptance, that community. I felt that in Queen's Night Market, which, you know, even when I worked for that Filipino company, I didn't feel that there because coming from somewhere else, in their daily lives, they would get that feeling that they feel their color. I don't want to say racism because, you know, I don't want to go there. but they feel their color. So they come back to the office, they take it out on other people, you know, from the same place. And the difference is just so little and it becomes so big. So with, you know, the Queenside Market with Sam's fried ice cream, with completos, you know, we have the Chileans, the Koreans, the Chinese, the Japanese. The feeling of belonging, it's it's a very, very nice place to be at. it's even better than the place I call originally home, I think.
Okay. Well, gosh, I'm sorry some of you couldn't hear that. I'm going to stop. Wait, how do I stop share? Have I stopped share?
Right at the top there, and I can stop it for you if you'd like.
It says resume share, which kind of implies that I'm not sharing. It's the host has stopped my share. Okay, cool.
Yep, you should be good now.
Okay, you see me. So I wanted to start with that because it's easy to get wrapped up in all the excitement that like, what is the Queensland market and all the details. It's a brilliant plan invented by my husband, but I wanted you to first just hear from a vendor there who is not a food vendor, precisely because it gets very easy to get wrapped up in food stories. I love. I mean, it's great to talk about food, and it is very appealing, and I found it a very useful tool for talking about other issues. For example, racism. For example, you know, just immigrant like daily lives and being in two cultures at once and having family abroad and so many other issues that are in this collection in our interviews that have nothing to do with food that honestly I have to say from my biased perspective I'm probably more interested in, but I recognize that food has been a very, very useful way to get into that and to talk about it. It's so much easier to say, what did I have for dinner and why, than like, what are my views on, you know, racism in New York today as a starting point. So that's kind of been the MO of my whole project. Going to get back into back into the share screen. Sorry. Share sound. Share. Oh. So, what is the Queen's Night Market? Now you can have a little bit of the technicalities. Open air, family friendly, usually about 100 independent vendors selling merchandise, art, food, small scale cultural performances, all celebrating the rich cultural diversity and heritage of NYC and Queens. This is the language that is on the Queens Night Market website that actually helped my husband come up with long before we were married in 2014. And it's been interesting trying to hold the whole project to that because people inevitably always focus on the food, which has its strengths and its problems, as we will discuss. The Queens Night Market has helped launch 300 plus small businesses, mostly immigrant run. On average gets about 15,000 visitors a night, Saturdays, April through October since 2015, and of course on hiatus in 2020 due to the pandemic. It is run by a very nice man called John Wang, who I have to full disclosure is my husband. So I'm not like an objective, scholar, just intellectually curious in this. I mean, I was actually the premise of our friendship at first, long before we dated, was I just thought his idea was really cool and I wanted to help. But now we are married and I just want to make sure that obviously I'm biased. So I very much come into this project as an advocate. Actually, sometimes have qualms with the way he does things, but I do want it to succeed, and I want the vendors to succeed, and that's very much the spirit with which I go into my interviews and all the derivative projects from it. I'm not like here to critique, what they're doing. Though I am recording everything they say, and eventually, whatever they want to be made public will be in the archive. I wanted to document it because the official press coverage was not in depth enough. It was, again, very focused on the food, which is understandable, and because this is a moment in New York history where we're having a total foodie moment. You know, as the older generations love to make fun of my generation, especially a little younger, they're like, why are the kids so obsessed with food these days? I hear it all the time. And it really has become sort of a cultural moment. It's I would say a status signifier. Sometimes it's a cultural status, you know, people, the whole like phenomenon of Instagram food porn and all that stuff. Anyway, there's been some great press coverage of the night market, but it didn't capture what I loved, which was really just the amazing diversities and perspectives like Christine's on being in a community that is truly very diverse and welcoming, and what that means for just feeling your place in the world. And I was okay. And another reason I wanted to document is I was worried it wouldn't last. It's financially tricky to have artificially deflated capped prices. So everything costs $5 or less. Now there's some $6 exceptions at the night market, but basically it's open to everyone. It's a very welcoming, affordable, fun event. And so I was worried it might not last. And of course, the pandemic hit, and then I also wanted to document how that affected the businesses. And that's been a whole new chapter in the project that I couldn't possibly have predicted. And I was very sad to have had to document that on some levels, but there have also been success stories. Some have transitioned very well. What's in it so far? About 70 interviews, 50 of which are in the book. Can you see me also, or just the screen? You can see me also? And good. So this is the book, and there's like profiles, and I'll talk about it more. But there's like 50-ish interviews on that are video pre-pandemic. And I think the video was a really important aspect. And there've been like 15 pandemic follow-ups, remote interviews. I wanted to do more, but I actually kind of pulled the brakes because a lot of it just felt too chaotic, and we can talk about that some other time. You just heard the Christine audio clip, just to get a sense of the range. I know people want to talk about food, but I always want to talk about the not food, because I think that's kind of the exciting part, is that people do want to buy a cookbook. You know, I don't know how many people want to buy an oral history book about a variety of immigrants' lives, but people did want to buy a cookbook, and that worked. And so, you know, it's important to association. Content. I can't even remember what I mean by that. Oh, that's exactly what I meant by that. How will it be used? Well, that's the thing. When you make an oral history archive, you have no idea how it will be used. You can hope. You know, it used to be, you know, in my first year or so at OMA, we studied all these things about, you know, for future historians. Everything's for future historians. I have a great respect for future historians, but, you know, I only care so much about future historians. Like, of course, I want future historians to know, you know, that this happened, and I want them to know that there was a moment in New York history where people could get food from all over the world for very cheap and hang out and talk about it, and that was a fun cultural moment. I do want people to know that. I do want people to hear the details of immigrant small business owners' lives and what matters to them, and why being a small business owner matters to them, and how they go about it, and the conflicts that arise. I do want all of that on the official record, but for history books, I don't know. What I care more about, I guess, in the immediate, just because I care obviously about John and the Queensland market and the vendors themselves, is I want them to succeed in the immediate. And I want people to care about stories like theirs in a general sense. I want to make sure that they are a huge part of New York City culture. And so, so these will be archived ultimately at the Nunn Center for Oral History in entirety, which is an amazing center that will be able to put everything online and index, and it will be very multimedia and accessible. And that's why I'm excited to work with them. And additionally, the pandemic interviews will be at the Queen's Memory Project locally. But who uses them once they're in the archive? The videos will be there, so any documentary filmmaker could use it, journalist could use it, you name it. I was a little nervous about this. How will these stories be used? And that's why that's why I got started on my own projects, to sort of guide that trend. Because an oral history archive is only used so much as people know about it, and people only know about it when you make a stink about it. So I decided to make a stink in the most public, accessible way I knew how. So we've got The World Eats here, which is a cookbook with oral histories, and the associated promotional media and events, which I cannot emphasize enough. Like, you think you're writing a book, you're really writing like the next 2 years of your life and all the events that you're gonna go and do around it, and all the talking points and the questions you're gonna answer. In many ways, and it's a book or a film or whatever you make that's very public facing ends up being an excuse to talk about things you care about. I learned this from the film world. I used to work in film, and I've done a few like film festival circuits, and yeah, it's nice screening films, it's nice getting awards, but what's really cool is getting in front of an audience that you would never talk to otherwise, and having them have a reason to care about something you care about and start a conversation with them about it. So I cannot underestimate that enough. And then the Sporkful, there's a podcast episode that we'll look at, and Culinary Backstreets is an online food journal, and we had a very interesting collaboration with publishing edited audio clip, and hopefully there'll be more of those. So a bit about those. The World Is Here. I'm going to show you my Blad, which is a cool little publishing thing. How do I, wait, gosh, stop. I have to stop and, no, don't stop cloud recording. What did I do? Sorry.
You're okay. I'll make sure the recording stays on.
I went to stop share screen so I could show you my Blad, which is on Acrobat Reader. There we go. Share. Okay. Can everyone see that? Okay, here we go. So this is a handy little 7-page promotional thing to just to give you a sense of what's in the book and what it looks like. So there's my photo that I'm very proud of, and they made it look much prettier than it actually is at the night market with these lights that we do not actually have there. And but maybe we will someday. And we worked with this wonderful art director, and we just could not have been luckier with the being chosen by this publisher. I mean, we had a choice of two, but we really want to work with them because they promised they could make it under $20, and they could make it very visually appealing, which is really important for us. We wanted it to feel like the night market, which was very, accessible to everyone and fun and colorful. So we have these great illustrations, this sort of scrapbook aesthetic. This is the contents, just to give you a sense. You can see like little dots. It's just a smattering from whichever vendors wanted to participate in the cookbook. We tried to get a geographic spread. And that's me and John, and here's a sample chapter. Wanda, she's been with the night market for ever. Since the beginning, she's one of the great heroes of the night market. And she does it just for fun. So she says, but she's super pro and amazing. And then here's just a sense of what the other pages will look like. Here's another sample chapter from Mauritius. You see, some people don't know where Mauritius is. So making things kind of visually poppy. This is obviously not an academic book. Publishing in May. So that's a sad story. Wait, how do I stop share? Am I back? So yeah, we unfortunately were due to publish in May, and then the pandemic hit. And the launch was supposed to be right when the night market reopened, and of course it could not reopen. So it's been a mixed bag, but it's been a really interesting adventure. And moving on to the promotional events, it turned into an excuse to talk about the state, what all of the press contacts, because John is amazing at doing press releases for the Queen's Night Market that he typically does. So we totally piggybacked on that for the book promotion, telling all the major media outlets we have this book coming out. And we ended up getting totally different kind of interviews and press coverage than we had anticipated, because they were like, instead of, oh, here's this fun night market you can check out, it was like, oh my gosh, how are all these vendors doing during the pandemic? Because sure enough, all the businesses were, having a very rough time. Many of the vendors, their day jobs was in the food service industry. They worked as waiters or bartenders. And so, they lost their day job and their side job at the same time. And it was really rough. And having this book out in the world really helped us draw attention to that fact and connect, people who cared. Like, suddenly we all saw this happening. There were all these, grants and initiatives, and I'm sure they're all very well-meaning, but like a lot of them really had trouble reaching the people they actually wanted to impact. And having this book out there helped John and me be a sort of connector. Just sort of, people wanted, people wanted to hear from, suddenly, like, oh, like I want to hear from the vendors themselves, what's going on, and we could make that connection and facilitate that in a way that we probably couldn't if we hadn't published the book and already gone through that process, not just of creating an oral history project, but of also working on each chapter with the vendors themselves. So each chapter has here's Francis, who's actually the subject of the Sporkville podcast interview that I'll show you. So she's super cool. She's got her rainbow T-Rex. She talks about being the most visible lesbian family at the Queen's Night Market, which is not a given because it's a mishmash of culture. You've got some very conservative cultures mixing with this super out family, and it's just lovely to see that interaction and to hear about it. Anyway, so she makes Puerto Rican food. She's from New York, but her family's Puerto Rican. So it's got this biographical, each chapter has this biographical portion that is derived from the interviews I did. And it's a mixture of first person and third person. And that was the hardest thing to do, editing wise, to make it cohesive and compelling. But the fact that we went through that negotiation process with each vendor, we went back and forth on oh, what do you think of focusing on this? What do you think of that? this quote, anything you would tweak. Going through that process was just wonderful, and it just establishing this relationship of storytelling that then helped me be more of an advocate, and John also by proxy, during this whole pandemic thing. We gained sort of we all of us gained this like new language of storytelling, which has its pluses and minuses. Not everyone wants their story out there to begin with, so it's a big step to take. But I think as much as possible, having these stories out there in whatever way the vendors are comfortable with ends up really mattering. We were so flattered when, now I'm going to talk about the sporkful. I'm going to reshare my screen with my project. So yeah, promo, I talked about that. So yeah, the sporkful, I don't know if I can click from here. No, I'm just going to go straight to, where is it? Here it is. So I don't know if you all know this. It's a very popular podcast. I didn't know anything about podcasts. I don't think I'd ever listened to a podcast before, but except like in class at OMA. And honestly, sorry. But I was super flattered that because the book was out there and because we were putting out all these press releases, we got an invitation from this podcast, which everyone was like, oh, wow, that's a really big deal. I didn't know that. And they made this wonderful episode featuring Frances, who I just showed you. And they used significant portions, direct quotes from my oral history project. So it was just a wonderful collaboration. I cannot highly recommend enough. Putting yourselves out there and advocating and standing up for what you need for your project. If you have an oral history project and you're doing something public facing, that's the tension. The rules of the podcast world and film and all of that typically don't have anything like what we oral historians have in terms of consent and ongoing consent and feedback. But if you don't ask, you don't get, as my former therapist used to say. And I really found that was true with so many of these derivative projects, and it's been such a pleasure. And I really want to encourage you to find collaborators like this and just ask for what you need. So the Sporkful reached out and was like, can you connect us with the vendors? And do you have, portions from the oral history project that you would share? And I had to go back and forth on like, well, can I share the whole thing, or what part are you allowed to use? And I sort of acted as the middleman between the vendors and the producers of this thing that is like far beyond my ability. Like I never could have produced anything like this or reached audiences that they have. And it was just awesome that I asked. And in each case, they were like, well, that's not our usual policy. We're the producers, but we understand that's very important to you and we'll make it work. And they absolutely did. And I managed to, so for each of the vendors who were featured in this, they got essentially veto power over the cut that they wanted to use, and that they did use, which is so important. You can make an oral history collection and put in an archive, but, to make something that the people that your narrators will actually be happy with is so much harder. And I'm not saying I have succeeded. I know I've made some mistakes and will probably continue to make them, but being able to sort of babysit a project beyond just the making of the archive into sort of guiding the first few derivative projects, I feel like it puts into the atmosphere, the greater consciousness, a sense of what this project's about and what are the sorts of stories one could be looking for. What are some of the ways one could use the project? So like, I don't know if I'm allowed to play this if you're recording and it's going to be on your thing, right? I don't know how that.
We can always edit it out. We can
Yeah.
play it for the people who are here and edit it later. Yeah.
Well, I just want to give a little sense of it. But basically it's like how she like came out as a teen and got kicked out by her mother, who, you know, later on in life over food they bonded again, and now she's part of the night market vendor community. Oh, it's not even working now. Well, forget it. Anyway, I'm sharing the link. You could all check it out. It's a wonderful story, and it's so well produced, and I'm so honored that they wanted to work on this. And I'm also so happy that that they really worked with me on all the details and all the, you know, oral history ethical standards that are not a given. The next derivative project is an ongoing. This was aimed at sort of a more foodie audience. It's a food focused. Well, I guess Sporkful. It's obviously a foodie audience, but it seems it's so popular. I just couldn't believe how many people wrote to me afterwards saying, "Oh, wow, I had no idea you were even doing oral history these days, but I heard about your project on the Sporkful." So that was awesome. But this is the first of what will hopefully be a series of actual excerpts. Just kidding. Edited audio clips from excerpts, coupled with a recipe that they feel like sharing. So this is Snow's Burmese tea leaf salad, which is, if you haven't tried, is the most amazing thing. And they shared the audio here, and this is something that I made. Here.
Wait, Storm, we're having the same thing with some audio. Let's try stopping and making sure the box is checked, or you can skip it.
Yeah, the box is checked. I don't know what's going on.
There might be a lag because some folks can, some folks can't.
Yeah. Well, no worries. I'm going to give you the clip. I just want, if for those of you who could not hear, I shared that clip because it gives a sense of one of the struggles that I have had in the sort of general derivative products. Snow only came to the US a handful of years. Well, I guess it's been a while now. Like 8 years at this point. Anyway, she, started learning English as an adult, and she talks about her struggles learning English and how hard she's worked at it in her interview. But she still has an accent, and sometimes her grammar is not what standard American English official grammar is. And those are the kind of moments that are really interesting, and I think especially important to pay attention to when creating derivative products from an interview. So you've got the interview, you've got the text. Wait, am I sharing? I'm not sharing.
You are. We're seeing culinary backstreets.
Oh, we are. Good. I don't know why I still have that. Oh, it's because I just checked the sound. So we have So I made this transcript, and Snow and I went through it, and she basically said, can you fix whatever it is so it just doesn't look embarrassing, make sure it's clear. So it's like slightly tweaked, and it's not a totally literal transcript. But at the same time, I wanted to capture her voice and the way she associates words, so I wasn't gonna like turn it into my language. But that's a point of tension that I still struggle with, and I struggled with throughout the book. Well, I mean, only with the vendors who had non-standard English, but like really wanting to capture their voice and the way they tell stories, but then also like really wanting to make them look good, because my first motive in this is advocacy. I really want them to look good. I want people to care about their stories, and I want people to care about their businesses. So there was a lot of back and forth over, which parts could be direct quotes and which I would have to sort of translate into third person, which I didn't want to do. In my ideal world, everything would be first person. But it's hard to make a catchy 1 or 2 page chapter out of pure quotes from an oral history project. So now I'm going to share and reshare my PowerPoint. Culinary bets. So these are my main takeaways and things I've struggled with, and that you might have an answer for me or for the questions. The first thing I considered was, what is the benefit to the narrators of the short-term publicity, which will inevitably arise if you're making some public-facing project, like a short film or an exhibit or something or a book. Like in my case, it was easy because they're all small business owners, and I felt like that kind of simplified the ethics of it, because they all definitely want more business. But it definitely affected the content of what went in there. If there isn't an obvious benefit of short-term publicity, for example, I have that with the pandemic stories. Some of the vendors have shut down their businesses, unfortunately. It's embarrassing and sad, and maybe you don't want to talk about it. If you've had this business that you've cared a lot about, you poured your heart and soul into it, and then because of the pandemic, you had to shut down. Maybe you don't want to do Q&As about that right now. And that's kind of the wall I hit with the pandemic interviews in terms of publicizing them. A lot of them just don't feel right to share publicly yet, because the vendors are just going through transitions, and in many cases, like deep personal loss. And some are super brave and do want to talk about that and vouch for other people in their similar situation, and power to them. But that's not a given. And I really beg anyone doing wanting to put their stuff out there to really take time to consider the personal impact of putting anything out on a large scale. You're going to get a lot of, if you actually succeed in putting it out there, you're going to get a lot of, press inquiries and attention that you don't necessarily want about that particular thing. So other considerations, your own limitations, how much mediating can you do between the narrators and the public? This is sort of the phase that I'm in now, that I call like babysitting the project. I know the publishers don't want me to say this. Of course they want me to say it's all about the book. And I'm very, very glad it is out there. But for me, the end goal was to create interest in the whole oral history project. I want, 5-10 years from now, I want people to know that this project exists to be able to look up the interviews and listen to them in full and hear all of the stories that some have nothing to do with food at all. And so for me, all of the things in between, like the book and the podcast and everything, all the media stuff was just kind of babysitting the project to make sure that, you know, there's a Google search, trail that leads to the project that's in the sort of public consciousness. But that's a lot of work. Also, advocacy, critical stance, your motives versus conflicts and content of interviews. I had, for the most part, a very easy time. For the most part, agreed with a lot of my narrators' stories, but there are other projects that are much more conflictual, and that has its own issues. Audience, who do you want to hear the stories? Okay. Specifically, I'm running out of time, so I'm trying to skip through. So one more thing I want to say about the publicity. Like, obviously, if your narrators are all about being in the spotlight, you're lucky. But if that is the case, as was with me, there's usually a very particular story that they want to show, and probably you are a different person. You're going to have a different idea of what is the story and what is the most interesting or should be out there. It's so compelling. It's so, there's dominant narratives are a very real potent force in culture, and a big part of how I designed the chapters, which if you read the book can be perceived, might seem a little chaotic because they don't seem to have much in the way of through lines. But that was, for me, a sort of a pushing back against the expected, like, narrative, like, oh, I've always had this passion, and so I started this thing, and instead I just tried to find random little excerpts that showed the sheer diversity of the people in this community, and their different lives, and that was sometimes a little bit of a negotiation with the vendors and also with the publishers, though my editor was brilliant and totally got it. But there was, there's you want a happy ending in a 2-page bio in a book. And as oral historians, we are all about the complexity of stories. And so there's a little bit of a conflict there. So there are different ways to do that. And then obviously, if there are no immediate benefits to short-term publicity, can you give back in other ways for participating in a project? And if there are costs to them, how to mitigate that. So I've, tried my best to be able to be available to help with, any sort of storytelling endeavors that are necessary to running a small business. But it's the cost can be real if somebody doesn't want, if you're used to just being like showing the happy, you have to sell your product if you're a business person. So if you're used to just saying like, oh, we make this food because it's great and we love it, and then you decide, oh no, I actually do want to share this kind of hard story about my childhood or something, then how do you deal with the effects of that? And I think it really is whoever's endeavor that is, it's your responsibility to help clean up the mess that you made, if so. PR is a part-time job. At least recognize your strengths, recognize what your weaknesses are, find ways to delegate and outsource and collaborate. I think that speaks for itself. Advocacy. I think from the beginning, write down your main motive for recording and sharing these stories. It'll help guide you when there's conflicts, which will inevitably occur. You know, the publisher or a journalist or an interviewer or the narrator themselves, will push back at some point, or, want a particular narrative. And if you're babysitting, what can you do? The why is pretty important. So I always said the why is as an advocate rather than as a scholar, because it's so easy to, and that's a real choice. Like, I realized that I've shut a lot of doors for myself, probably academically, but I don't really care. That's not my world. But by being more of an advocate and by writing something that is not at all, scholarly, and being, unabashedly an advocate. So whenever in doubt, yeah. So political differences I do want to bring up. So this is as a potential conflict. Sorry for being too abstract. So you're interviewing someone, you want to promote their business, and they voice a political opinion which is like very offensive to you. What do? You consult your motive. If your motive is scholarly and you want to, for example, examine these differences, work accordingly. In my case, that's not my motive. I wanted to advocate for the businesses, so I would just, for the most part, disregard unless I could find a way to slip it in as subtly as possible. Big conflicts, things that, so these are very, for the most part, easy on the mind, easy on the spirit stories, and they're just a tip of the iceberg. And they're in some ways a they're obviously not a fabrication, but to the extent that any 2-page version of something that's 100 pages is a fabrication, because you're making a selection between what is going to be seen by the public, and that becomes the story that's out there. My hope is that eventually that leads to the real story, which is far more complex, as every human's life is. But that was for me a struggle that I sometimes had, and I disagreed with. I've had some totally embarrassing moments, like with one vendor. He was telling me like why he came up with some new recipe, because he was catering to an American audience, and he's like, because Americans like, what was it, corn or something. And I was like, Americans don't like corn? What are you talking about? I was like so offended. But I mean, what do I know? Just because I don't. Anyway, it was like not worth it. So for me, I came away from that interview and I was like, I can't believe he puts corn because he thinks Americans like it. But like, that really has no place in, all of the promoting his, he told so many other stories that were really much more important for the purposes of showing, what an interesting life and the meaning of selling his food at the night market was. So I left that out of the book and any other derivative projects. But that's the kind of thing that, is definitely in there, and will always be in a project if it's interesting and real. Ideal audience was, who do you want to hear and read these stories? How are you going to reach them? How might you accidentally alienate them? The last one was a big one for me. I admittedly grew up in a very small bubble of liberal, cosmopolitan, my dream was that some like Trump supporter housewife in like the Midwest would pick up this book just because she was just like, ooh, food. And then read these stories and be like, oh, people from other places are kind of cool and have, you know, experiences that I can relate to. And this food is kind of good. Like that was my dream. I still hope that that's happening. I've heard a few, and it's amazing. Some of the vendors actually have cousins who've live, you know, in these kind of far-flung places where I always imagine there's like no immigrants whatsoever, but there are. And I hope that it's spreading. But that was a lot to consider, like a lot of ways of approaching the world that I take totally for granted in my New York, you know, overeducated, multicultural, you know, totally privileged bubble, I had to explain and present a totally different way and really run many drafts by people far and wide and listen carefully, very carefully to the publishers. Like publishers are publishers because they know how this works, and it's really worth listening to them. And I had a lot of futile arguments that I'm glad I lost in the end. So, and then, yeah, obviously, workshop, man. What time is it? I ruined the timing, didn't I?
It's 20 past.
Can I give homework instead of workshop time?
Yeah.
No. Well, okay, this is the important part because I'm going to skip to this first because I want everybody to stay in touch, and please email me. I don't think that I've mastered this phenomenon at all. I'm not sure the book has even sold particularly well, because, you know, we're in a pandemic year. Of course it will next year. Knock on wood, no. But I'm just saying, you know, it was putting all these things out there is a big, you know, it's an embarrassment in some ways. You know, as soon as everybody was like, congratulations, how do you feel? And I just felt miserable for the first like 2 months. I just was filled with regrets and like, oh, what did I do wrong? And, you know, you're constantly worrying you're misrepresenting people. And it was just a constant source of dread and anxiety. And it's only actually the derivative stuff and the promotional events and seeing how it really resonates with audiences that I never could have reached on my own, that really gave me confidence to be like, okay, well, it's flawed, but it's out there and it's doing a good thing. It's doing what I wanted it to do. And I just really want to share that process because I know it's, especially at OMA, which is just like the best of the best and has, you know, all these great high standards, and you learn to do things so well and you want to do things so well. And it will always feel like a big concession in some ways, making something for the rest of the world. And you'll feel like you're, you know, being bad in a way, dumbing things down. It doesn't have to be that way, but maybe it's just me. But my guess is it's pretty common, that it just feels like this nagging, like, you know, like, oh, real oral historians won't look at me anymore, and you know, what did I do wrong? And but I really encourage you to put things out there because the power of oral history, as I'm sure you all know, is very real when it's out in the world, and it's just so refreshing to see renewed interest. Like we're in such a wonderful moment right now during the pandemic. Like all of a sudden, people actually want to hear the you know, thanks to Black Lives Matter movement and the general state of crisis. I don't know what it is or something. I mean, it's been a miserable year, but for oral history, I have to say it's been kind of a great year. People suddenly really care. And kind of whatever you can put out there publicly, I wholeheartedly encourage you to do it, even though it might be flawed, because it just provides a talking point. And people desperately do want to have these conversations. So that's the note I want to, that's the end. Okay. So this is how you stay in touch. This is my email. Please write me any questions. Vendor Stories, my slapstick put together website where you can listen to a few audio clips. The World Eats Here cookbook on Instagram, because the world, not that I'm very good at that. I really want to hear questions, so I don't want to, I don't know. Can I email everybody my homework afterwards?
Yeah, since folks are registered via Eventbrite, we can send resources and ideas and things to do, for sure.
Okay. I had a fun little project. I
I
want to hear questions, though.
Yeah, stop the screen share so we can see more folks, if that's okay. Storm, thank you so much. There's a lot of love coming in the chat as well. But if everyone would just join me in thanking Storm and congratulating her, words are hard, on a really wonderful and valuable and helpful presentation. And yes,
I don't know what's going on with my voice. We've forgotten to speak in the pandemic era, right?
Right, we haven't been using them. Using them as much.
Terrible.
If anyone has questions, we have 5 more minutes, and I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer if Storm, you're up for it, but no worries if not. Yeah, this has been really, really valuable and helpful to hear. Folks, feel free to put questions in the chat and I'll read them out, or raise your hand and ask them out loud. It's just love coming into the chat, Storm. I don't know. So Brandon has posed one. What was the process like in finding an interested publisher? And also feel free to just, if you see questions in there that you're
And will I follow up with the film? Yeah, well, actually, I skipped that part. I didn't want to try to keep it for 4 points per section. But my current derivative project is, as Liza knows, my thesis project is an audio installation at the Queen's Night Market live. So I'll have little 1 to 3 minute clips, probably even shorter, on various topics for whichever vendors wish to participate and have their interviews on file. And there'll be a QR code at each tent. And so while you're waiting in line, especially in the socially distanced era, the lines will be less fun because you can't be crowded and next to all these fun people and chatting up a storm. You'll have to be all distance. And so with our stupid smartphones, I'll give them something to do, which is to listen to a minute on whatever topic, one of several topics that is available, from the voice of the person whose food you're about to try. So there will always be at least one about the actual food, but also stories, which is my favorite part, about completely other stuff. What it's like to be dragged to live in America as a teenager from Cambodia who really was having a great time being a teenager in Cambodia and did not want to move here. And trying Costco chicken for the first time. Gross. I love that. It's one of my favorite stories. Yeah, so that's an audio installation I'm currently working on, and as well as video clips that might be screened, because there's currently a drive-in movie theater in the Queen's Night Market space, and it may have to share space if it's in the same location this year. That's all very up in the air and kind of hush-hush, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. But yeah, I'm definitely working on audio installation and a film right now. And Brandon, publisher, that is the most important thing. I am so grateful I went with the experiment. Obviously, this is not something I could have done on my own at all. I completely hopped on my husband's popularity. People had been approaching him for years to do a cookbook, and so he already had an interested agent, which was very helpful. And I was just like, well, I was planning on doing something with my oral history project, so obviously we should do it together. So we did. But, you know, he had all the connections to begin with, and then the agent put us in touch with publishers, and basically it was between the experiment was, I can't remember if they were first to express interest, but they were totally on board with, I used to be a production designer, so I made this like whole spread of like the aesthetic, the lookbook, like how I wanted it to have the scrapbook aesthetic and be very like friendly, and like a family photo album. And we made some sample pages, and they were totally on board with that. The other publisher, who I will not name, that we talked to, wanted to make it like a glossy, like coffee table book that would cost like $40 or something ridiculous, and be like, and they wanted this photography that would be very like clean and, you know, spritzed with silicone or something on a white background. Like, sorry, I know there's a place for cookbooks like that in the world, but it was really not the vibe we were going for. We did not want to be like, ooh, here's this fancy thing you can make. We wanted to be like, you know, these are family recipes. These are just people. And it's relatable for a lot of people. And that was a big point. So it was so important. And for me, I probably actually ruined our relationship with the other publisher, because I think I made my disgust kind of obvious in our interviews. But, you know, I was like, well, and of course we're going to give the narrators final say and how the chapters look, and, you know, they get to see it at XYZ points in the edit. And they're like, we don't do that. And I'm like, I do that. And they're like, we don't do that. Like, I do that. So, like, you know, if you're, you know, an oral historian, if you have some association with Columbia, if you're on this thing, you're in a position of power some way that you can talk to a publisher and tell them exactly what you're going to do. And you can win that argument, which is not necessarily the case of whoever stories you're representing. So I urge you to fight for what you need. And, you know, I sent them links to the OHA best practices and everything. I'm like, well, this is what I'm doing. You know, if you want to work with me, you work with these. And it's so nice to hear, you know, for the most part, you know, there are a few conflicts, obviously, people we didn't end up working with, but for the most part, people are like, wow, that's such a cool system. How come journalists don't use this? How come TV producers don't use this? And I'm like, yeah, you know, why not? Anyway, for the most part, people are really thrilled to hear about the wonderful world of oral history and what we do and how we do it and our best practices. And so please do not hesitate to enforce your standards on the rest of the world.
That's awesome, Storm. Thank you so much for sharing that. Your courage is really inspiring. Like, courage and moxie and all of those good things, like, is really, really cool to hear. And a lot of people are also appreciating it in the chat, which I can send you after this. If anyone has to leave sort of right at our usual time, I just want to let you know that our next event will be next week, Thursday, March 25th. Joseph Plaster will be presenting on performing Black queer history in Baltimore's Cathedral of Books, which will be a super fun event. So I encourage you to come back. There is one more question in the chat, Storm, that I also had. So I would be curious to ask it if you have time to stick around.
What, the funding sources? Oh, wait.
No, the one about Casey brought up, you mentioned having feudal arguments with publishers that you were glad you lost in the end. What were those arguments, and why were you glad that you lost? I'm curious.
Oh, well, I mean, let me think of one. Oh my gosh, I see a moth. I can't believe it. Moths are the worst. I have too many wool things in my closet.
It looks like all of those walls are cedar, though. I mean, how is that happening?
Yeah, it's a scam. It doesn't even work. okay, like stylistic things. Well, I mean, that's not important. But there, you know, that like the house publishing will have its own style. Something about, what was it? It was like capitalizing after a comma or after a semicolon. Drove me nuts. I was just like, this looks ugly. This looks pretentious. I just couldn't stand it. But it was like, you know, the house publishing rules. So finally I ended up actually I think I ended up going through my entire manuscript and finding all my, I can't remember what it was, semicolons or colons or something, and just taking them out because I didn't want to see the capital letter afterwards because it was just struck me as annoyingly academic or something. I think there's one slipped in there. Anyway, that was fine for the most part. Some things, word count big time. You know, if you would have left me to my druthers, this would be like a 400-page book. And they were very strict about the space limitations. And I was so bad at that. Obviously, I'm long-winded and I just love stories. So like every little detail. I mean, we're all oral historians. We're here because we love stories. So I'm sure you all relate. But yeah, having somebody who knows the audience that you don't know is so important. And sure enough, you know, publishers are there for a reason. I already said that. But yeah, any specific, I probably would have had, you know, I come from a experimental theater, filmmaking, performance art background. You know, I love when everything's like weird and unfinished and leaves questions in the air and everything's just kind of a mystery. And I think, you know, the mystery of human life, you know, you can never really, you can't, it's insulting to even think that you can like sum up a life in a page. And so I wanted it to be like as snapshot as possible. Just like, here's a scene from this person's life, here's a scene from that person's life. But of course, you know, this is where the publishers themselves were like, you know, can you have a little bit more of a conventional bio structure? And I'm like, no. But then again, I consulted my primary motive, which was to promote the businesses and make them accessible, and make them relatable. And so I did semi-resentfully add in a few more like straightforward biographical details than I probably would have had I been left to my own devices. Yeah, and I'm very grateful for that.
Thanks for sharing. Thank you all so much for sticking around, and thank you, Storm, for your extra time, and for sharing this whole process with us and what you've learned from it and what you're still learning from it. And this has been really, really helpful. And I'm excited to send out resources. So you all check your emails for those. Storm and I will put that together and get that out to you. Go ahead.
Oh, I just saw that Amy made the injera. I am so impressed. That is hard. That one is super hard. I totally failed at that one. That's
yes. Awesome. Oh, and Liza, thank you for putting the link to the book in there as well. If folks missed that, it's up a few chats. And yeah, as I said, our next event is next week, March 25th, and Joseph Placer will be presenting on performing Black queer history in Baltimore's Cathedral of Books, which should be really, really fun. I won't be here for that one, unfortunately, but Amy Starczewski, my co-coordinator for the series, will host. She's waving. Some of you may be able to see her now. So hope you come back next week. And we have 2 more events in the series this year. And thank you again, Storm, so much for all of this work and for sharing your evening with us.
Yeah, thanks you guys for all being here and prompting me to try to get my thoughts together.
Thank you, Storm.
Thank you, Storm. It was great.